I want to talk about something that I've talked about before a few times and came up to some degree during my conversation with Distributus, but I want to go into some more depth. And that is the concept of the romantification of romance. Now, as you know, as I've said a few times, I've mentioned various films that appeared in the 80s, the 90s, films like Harry Met Sally, You've Got Mail, Serendipity. And all these films were part of a priming of the culture, to my mind, that was pushing the culture in a certain direction with respect to relationships between men and women. Basically, commodifying them, but also, at the same time, turning romance into some kind of magical process. A lot of these films are based on happenstance or circumstance, or in the case of Serendipity, actual serendipity. And through sheer chance and luck, the power of love overcomes all and everything. And that was the brand that was being sold and peddled to people throughout the 80s, but in particular in the 90s is really when it picked up, all the way through the early 2000s. Now, of course, during most of this time, with the exception of one film, You've Got Mail, with Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks, which explores some very early internet interactions at the level of romance. This is without the internet. We're talking mostly about cultural priming of the consciousness of people, priming of society, priming of civilization. And a lot of people discount how important that is and how much impact it actually had long term, because I think one flows into the other, which is to say you had a cultural priming vis-a-vis these films in earlier times, primarily the late 80s and throughout the 90s to early 2000s, which set the tone for what was to come thereafter, which is to say online dating and the internet in general, including social media, Tinder, etc., etc. Because it's easy to talk about the impact of things like social media and online dating and Tinder and the whole shebang without taking into account some of the things, at least, that primed all this, created the backdrop, and facilitated it all. Namely, the ease of romance. Romance is just a magical thing. Relationships are a magical thing. And above all, relationships either work or they don't, which is to say you meet somebody and there's this magical moment. Some people call it love at first sight. The incels and extreme black pillars would call it Chad struck. And boom, you have it. Then the credits roll, and that's it. Now, of course, I'm not the first person to mention this. Hollywood, in particular, has described relationships in a very idealistic way, whereby all the quote-unquote work that goes in after is often neglected and not mentioned. But it's less about that, to my mind, and more about just how it all works. You meet somebody, and then magic happens. Now, even though a lot of the Zoomers and younger millennials didn't catch wind of this directly or otherwise, they're nonetheless recipients of particular cultural undercurrents that took place prior to their births. And so you have the situation where this has become a mainstream expectation, meeting somebody and it just works, or meeting somebody and you just really like the person and you don't invest the time or energy to further discover if there might be some possibility of something working out between you two. And apps, of course, facilitate this all the more by way of making it really about looks primarily. And then we have issues of overchoice and the paradox of choice, which of course I've talked about several times, exclusively in one large video. You add all this into the mix and you have the current mess that we have today. And so you have this problem. These films, the culture in general, entertainment created this backdrop which informs downstream the current culture and the perception we have of romance and dating. But here's where the real problem lies. In these films, you actually see real magic to a certain degree, right? It's Hollywood. And so this contrived notion of somebody meets randomly in a department store or an airplane, that it somehow just works vis-a-vis magic, that is predicated, although they don't explicitly mention in the films, largely on the notion of love at first sight, but also the mechanism that underlies that, which is, of course, looks. Love at first sight, this is well correlated in studies you can look at, is largely predicated on the looks a person has and whether that works or not. And of course, where do we see this? We see this in modern dating apps, we see this in social media, and we see just in general how the young people engage with romance. But as important as looks are, as I've mentioned many times, not disregarding that at all, I would say that you need a little bit more than looks for long-term relationship success if you look at successful relationships. And there's another factor here. You might have, for example, heard about the term the 7-year itch, which is this not entirely proven but generally observed trend that after 7 years, marriages and long-term relationships tend to dissolve, and in particular, women tend to want to leave the relationship. And there are a whole bunch of potential reasons for this, but one reason that's been postulated, that again isn't proven but seems very unlikely, is that people have forgotten why men and women get together in the first place. It seems trivially easy to think about. A lot of people think, well, because of sex, or because of intimacy, and because of this or that. But all of those things are just vehicles for the purposes of reproduction. We are animals at the end of the day, and animals are there to reproduce. Now, why am I mentioning this obvious thing? Well, the theory goes, and it's not proven, but it seems likely, that prolonged, protracted relationships without the prospect of children tend to fizzle out very frequently, because subconsciously the individuals involved in the relationship realize that it's not leading in the quote-unquote right direction. Now, it used to be pretty obvious to everyone under the sun, from the wisest and smartest of people to the dumbest, that relationships were begun and consummated between men and women for this purpose. Now, it doesn't mean you cannot have a relationship for the sake of companionship, but think about the reasons why people get together today. It's for those proximal, primordial reasons of hooking up and box and getting laid and that sort of thing. Now, you could make an argument that all that primes individuals, young individuals, for reproduction later, but if we go back to this notion of magic and setting the culture, the romantification of romance, you see the after effect that very few people, with a few exceptions, have that in mind when they start relationships. Very few people think, oh, I need to find somebody who is compatible for a long-term relationship, would on top of that would produce good offspring, is reliable, and blah, blah, blah. So you stick both as a man and a woman with the short-term mating prospects in terms of your strategy. So in terms of men, you'll screw anything. In terms of women, you just go for the bad boy or the Chad without thinking about the long-term prospects of how this might work in a long-term relationship, in addition to what sort of bearing it might have on children down the line. And the most important factor here is to observe that the mentality of why and wherefore people enter into relationships in the first place has run askew. And that is also a large confounding factor in this whole mating and dating mess these days. In general, people are not actively speaking about having children. Sure, some are. But because romance, which is to say magic, and magical love at first sight processes are often felt to be the main driving factor behind why people will enter into a relationship in the first place, you end up with the current mess that we have. People don't think about relationships in the terms historically that they did, because relationships at the end of the day, why men and women get together at the end of the day, it is about children. The other stuff is almost always secondary. Companionship, sex, intimacy, whatever. Yeah, that's all part of it, and it's not impossible to have a relationship like that. But in general, without that long-term goal of having children, relationships don't really make much sense. Now, of course, I'm not arguing like Sargon of Dakar that you need to have children or you're immoral if you don't have children. I'm simply being descriptive about, generally speaking, why relationships come into being and what has gone awry in terms of our thinking and approach to relationships, which have become increasingly based upon this, inspired by these types of films and the culture coming from Hollywood, but also the undercurrents that we have absorbed and sucked in from that time about love at first sight and it just working. Have you ever noticed how in relationships in general, people, especially women, but people in general, are so willing to just dump a relationship at the drop of a hat because, well, there was some minor problem, rather than trying to work on the problem? And this is the thing. I'm hardly an advocate for relationships, as you know, but relationships do entail work. So the minute in the contemporary setting a relationship has any fissure, any sort of problem, then there's some issue and it needs to end unceremoniously. And that is, in my view, a long-term side effect of some of the cultural stuff that I was talking about and informs us to this day. It either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, the magic isn't there. And if it does work, the magic is there. And what happens when the magic peters out? It means it didn't work. The magic isn't there anymore. Pretty simple. So in summary, especially for the young people, I would say, if you are considering a relationship, never mind the difficulties of acquiring one, particularly as an average guy, but we'll set that aside for the time being. I've talked a lot about that. Then ask yourself why you want a relationship in the first place. Is it just about fun, validation, etc., etc., or is it about some long-term goal? And that is increasingly difficult to find. People who are actually reflecting about these things, because I don't blame them. The culture at every turn and every corner inspires the opposite and pushes people in the opposite direction. In any event, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, subscribe, comment, share. Do all those nice YouTube things if you can. Thank you very much. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.